For this part, I referred to Sears's book, as well as Yorktown's Civil War Siege, Drums Along the Warwick, by authors John V. Quarstein and J. Michael Moore, published by the History Press. Even after the Battle of Hampton Roads, the threat of the Merrimack had closed the James River to any Union naval sortie. By mid-March, Magruder had assembled very strong batteries on the York River as well. Around Yorktown, there were 7 water batteries. Altogether, these batteries had 25 heavy guns, including 8-inch Columbiads, 32-pound Columbiads, 9-inch Dahlgrens, and one 64-pound Columbiad. There was also a 42-pound carronade on the beach to repel an amphibious landing. On the Yorktown Heights, there were other heavy guns, including 24 and 18-pound artillery to assist in repelling any naval attack and siege works. The rebels also built defenses at Mulberry Island Point and Fort Crawford. The battery on the point had 5 42-pound guns. There were also fortifications on the south bank of the James called Fort Boykin and Fort Huger. Boykin had 10 42 and 32-pound cannons, while Huger had 13 heavy Columbiads, Dahlgrens, and hotshot guns. Gloucester Point had 8 32-pound cannons. By March 14th, Magruder reported that Federals were beginning to pressure the pickets on the Warwick Road. He continued to frantically message Richmond for reinforcements to the point that Robert E. Lee admonished him to stop. On March 20th, McClellan began considering a siege of Yorktown given the fierce defenses against an amphibious operation. He had experience with sieges, having served as an engineer at Veracruz in the Mexican War, and had been an observer at the siege of Sevastopol in the Crimean War. His siege train included heavy mortars and 30, 100, and 200-pound Parrott rifles. The Navy insisted on keeping the Monitor near Fort Monroe to protect the fleet against another attack by the Merrimack. Magruder and his Army of the Peninsula was resolved to fight along the Warwick, having spent much of March rapidly improving the defenses. He described his position, quote, "The Warwick Line upon which we rested may be briefly described as follows. Warwick River rises about 1.5 miles to the right of Yorktown. Yorktown and redoubts number 4 and 5, united by long curtains, and flanked by rifled pits from the left of the line until it reaches the Warwick River, a sluggish and body stream 20 or 30 yards wide, running through a dense wood fringed by swamps. Along this river are 5 dams, one at Wynn's Mill, one at Lee's Mill, and 3 constructed by myself. The effect of these dams is to back up to the water along the course of the river, so that for nearly 3/4 of its distance its passage is impracticable for either artillery or infantry. Each of these dams is protected by artillery and extensive earthworks for infantry." Unquote. To bolster the vulnerable gap between Yorktown and the Warwick River, Magruder built the White and Red redoubts and connected them with trenches and other earthworks. These redoubts were also fortified with heavy guns. By the beginning of April, Richmond had reinforced Magruder, and he had 11,000 men. 6,000 men held the flanks at Gloucester Point, Yorktown, and Mulberry Island, leaving 5,000 to man the length of the Warwick Line. In spite of this enormous disparity of force, the lack of competent intelligence gathering by McClellan's force began to work against him. At Young's Mill, Union reconnaissance reported that it was held by a strong force. In reality, the rebels only had 2 regiments there. On April 2nd, McClellan himself arrived on the peninsula. The Union Army of the Potomac Chief Engineer Brigadier General John Barnard wanted McClellan to attack Norfolk first to exterminate the Merrimack and open the James River, making any attack on Yorktown unnecessary. Despite Barnard's arguments, McClellan declined and insisted on an offensive up the peninsula. The Navy rejected any proposal to launch a major attack on the Gloucester Point position with McDowell's First Corps, not wanting to take their eyes off the Merrimack. This infuriated McClellan, seeing it as a deliberate sabotage from Washington. Fort Monroe had been garrisoned with 10,000 troops under Major General John Wool, the oldest active duty officer in the U.S. Army. By the time McClellan arrived on the peninsula, Wool was already 78 years old and had served in the Army for half a century. McClellan was prohibited from subsuming Wool's force into his own army, but he also did not ask Wool to assist his efforts. McClellan's intelligence network, provided by Allan Pinkerton and General Wool, stated that Magruder had between 15,000 to 20,000 men, but that his right flank was weak. McClellan resolved to attack at that area, reassured that the roads of the peninsula were well draining and clear of water obstacles. By running through the weak Confederate right flank, McClellan could then wheel right and cut off Magruder's retreat, trapping him in Yorktown. The 3rd Corps and part of the 2nd would march down the Hampton-York Road through Big Bethel and pin Magruder in place. This force would outflank the rebels at Young's Mill, forcing them to retreat. Next, the 4th Corps would advance up the Warwick Road through Warwick Courthouse and to the halfway house, where he could cut off Magruder's line of retreat. On April 4th, the Union Army began marching. The 4th Corps left Newport News with William Baldy Smith's division and the 5th U.S. Cavalry in the lead. Confederate pickets scattered at Waters Creek. At Young's Mill, the supposedly strong Confederate position fell back after firing only a few shots. Keyes noted the strong fortifications at Young's Mill and remarked to McClellan that with 5,000 troops, the rebels might have held his corps up for a week. The same day, the 3rd Corps left Hampton toward Big Bethel. This had been the site of one of the first land battles of the war the year before, and an embarrassing Union defeat. Here again, the Confederates abandoned their fortifications and fell back north. The 4th Corps resumed the march the next day at 6 a.m., with Smith's division again in the lead. By 7 a.m., a rain began and soon revealed that McClellan's intelligence on road drainage was flawed. Progress slowed. At 11 a.m., the head of the Union column was stopped at Lee's Mill by ferocious fire. Amazingly, neither the Warwick River's fortifications nor the Warwick Crossing itself had been noted in reconnaissance reports. A Colonel Thomas Jefferson Cram had drawn up a map earlier in the year, but made serious errors. He showed the Warwick River flowing parallel to the James and Mulberry Island as an actual detached island. Thus the Union troops were surprised not just by the heavy Confederate resistance, but by the presence of the Warwick River itself. Smith messaged Keyes that the halfway house would not be taken today. The rebel position was held by 1,800 troops commanded by Brigadier General Lafayette McLaws. Keyes sent a message to McClellan that the Confederate position at Lee's Mill was too powerful to take by direct assault. The first day's engagement at Lee's Mill had cost only 7 rebel casualties and 12 Union ones, but had derailed McClellan's plans completely. While McClellan waited to bring up his heavy artillery, Magruder began moving his troops up and down the line within view of the Federals to create the illusion of many more troops than he had. One lieutenant from the 14th Louisiana remarked that Magruder marched them back and forth between the James and York rivers 6 times. All the subterfuge worked perfectly, and McClellan became convinced that the Confederate army had more than 100,000 troops in front of him. The same day, Lincoln refused to release elements of the First Corps from Northern Virginia over to him, and the Navy again declined to attack up the York or James rivers in fear of the Merrimack. On the 6th, Thaddeus Lowe, a scientist and inventor accompanying the Army of the Potomac, ascended in his hydrogen gas balloon Intrepid to begin an aerial reconnaissance of the lines. Along the line, minor skirmishing broke out as both sides tried to gauge the strength of their opponents. Baldy Smith suspected that the Confederates were much weaker than they appeared. He ordered one of his brigade commanders, a brigadier general named Winfield Scott Hancock, to take his command and probe between Lee's Mill and Dam No. 1. General Charles S. Hamilton, commanding a division in the 3rd Corps, also suspected that the defenses were much weaker than they appeared. He and Heintzelman asked McClellan for permission to send a strong reconnaissance force through the gap between the Warwick River and Yorktown, but were denied. McClellan's favored lieutenant, Fitzjohn Porter, and Chief Engineer Barnard backed up McClellan's choice to stay put until Army engineers had thoroughly studied the enemy defenses. Back on the Union left, McClellan's order not to attack arrived at Smith's headquarters. Smith immediately recalled Hancock, who told Smith that he had found a weakness in the line and could have broken it easily. For the rest of his life, Smith remained convinced that he could have prevented the coming siege if McClellan's order had come 1 or 2 hours later. Ironically, a few Confederate prisoners were taken, and they deceptively convinced McClellan's intelligence officers that the line was 40,000 strong and would soon grow to 100,000. McClellan bought the bluff. While things seemed to be going in favor of the rebels, Magruder was worried. He knew about the aborted recon by Hancock and understood that the Union must have noted this weak point. He telegraphed Richmond about all the Union activity and expressed his opinion that eventually the sheer force of numbers would settle the issue. This same day, the first elements of Joe Johnston's army began arriving in Richmond from its positions on the Rapidan. The next day, the first 2 brigades from Johnston's army arrived in Yorktown. McClellan telegraphed Washington that Johnston had arrived and that he was likely outnumbered. He requested more men and more heavy guns. Lincoln once again urged McClellan forward to pierce the enemy's defenses, warning him that the enemy would use any delay to their advantage. In a letter to his wife, McClellan admitted that he was tempted to tell the president to come down to the peninsula and command the attack himself. On the 8th, another of Johnston's brigades arrived in Yorktown. Around this time, Union engineers finished surveying the enemy defenses, and McClellan began besieging the Warwick Line by building earthworks opposite the line but especially around Yorktown itself. His plan was to bring up all the heavy guns, bombard the defenses near the town, and break through once his artillery had destroyed them. For this, he deployed 14 batteries and built 3 redoubts for his heavy 8, 10, and 13-inch mortars, his 20, 30, 100, and 200-pound Parrott guns, and his 4.5-inch Rodman siege rifles. At Wormley Creek, he established a small debarkation base to offload the 101 heavy guns. New roads, pontoon bridges, and other crossings were built to bring up the guns to their emplacements. From batteries 1 and 4, McClellan could bombard everything from Wynn's Mill to Gloucester Point. Fitzjohn Porter was assigned to direct the siege operations. While all these preparations were being made, the siege devolved into sporadic cannonade exchanges and firefights between skirmishers as Union earthworks were slowly built. On the western end of the Union line, rebel gunboats on the James shelled the Federals as they worked. On the 10th, another of Johnston's brigades arrived, and so did Low's second balloon, Constitution. The next day, 3 more rebel brigades arrived, raising Magruder's force to 34,400. Both Johnston and Magruder expressed surprise at McClellan's lack of any attack, and Johnston told Lee that, quote, "No one but McClellan could have hesitated to attack," unquote. Fitzjohn Porter, meanwhile, ascended in one of Low's balloons by himself. The balloon broke free of its mooring ropes and began drifting to Confederate lines before winds pushed him back to safety. Around this time, the rebels also started aerial reconnaissance in a hot air balloon. While this was going on, the Merrimac left port and sailed into Hampton Roads. Union supply vessels scattered, and the Monitor emerged to face it. However, neither vessel wanted to fight where the other hoped to lure it. The Merrimac did not risk going into deep waters where it could be rammed, and the Monitor did not risk going into the narrow channels where it might be boarded. Taking advantage of the standoff, however, 2 rebel ships, the Jamestown and the Raleigh, slipped past the Monitor and captured 3 Union transports near Hampton Creek. Finally, the Merrimac withdrew back to Norfolk. On the 12th, Joe Johnston himself arrived in Richmond. President Davis transferred the Army of the Peninsula and the Norfolk garrison under Johnston's command and consolidated all of those forces plus his Confederate Army of the Potomac into the Army of Northern Virginia, although Johnston and Davis would refer to it by different names for the next few weeks. On the 14th, Johnston proposed to withdraw from Yorktown to Richmond itself. Davis called a council of war with Secretary of War George W. Randolph, Lee, General Gustavus W. Smith, and General James Longstreet. Johnston's first proposal was that the Army of Northern Virginia, including all personnel in Norfolk and the Peninsula, plus the garrisons of the Carolinas and Georgia, would concentrate at Richmond for a decisive battle. His second proposal was to leave Magruder to hold the peninsula and march on Washington with the rest of the army and force McClellan to withdraw. Longstreet advised that McClellan would not attempt any attack before May 1st. Smith supported Johnston's second proposal and wanted to continue the attack to Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York City. Randolph said that abandoning the peninsula meant abandoning the Navy yards in Norfolk, where ironclads were under construction, as well as the base of the Merrimac. Lee added that holding the peninsula would help give the Confederacy time to transition the one-year volunteers to indefinite volunteers, enlarge it via conscription, and avoid stripping the rest of the eastern seaboard of all its troops. In addition, the peninsula was a naturally good defensive position. After listening to all these arguments, Davis decided that Johnston would move his entire army to Yorktown and hold off the enemy for as long as possible. The same day, Magruder ordered the miners' farm line on Mulberry Island to be abandoned and built new redoubts between Skiffles Creek and Lee's Mill. Fort Crawford was left on its own. This allowed more troops to man the Warwick Line. 2 days later, there was a significant action on the Warwick Line. Dam No. 1 was guarded by rifle pits backed up by 2 trench lines behind, including artillery emplacements. There were 3 artillery pieces guarding this sector. One 12-pound Napoleon guarded the dam, a 6-pound gun and a 12-pound howitzer were in support, but unable to target Union lines. On this day, McClellan finally decided to attempt a limited attack. At 8 a.m., Brigadier General William Thomas Harbaugh Brooks' Vermont Brigade moved into action under covering artillery fire. The 3rd Vermont and 4th Vermont Infantry Regiments moved to the river on both sides of the dam. Facing them were the 2nd Louisiana Infantry and 15th North Carolina Infantry. Confederate counter-battery fire held off the Federals for 3 hours until they were finally silenced. McClellan personally arrived around noon. Realizing that the rebel position was very weak here, he ordered Baldy Smith to bring up his division and prepare to exploit any advantage if the Vermonters cleared the rifle pits. The 3rd Vermont went forward across the river under heavy fire and successfully took the north bank. Shaken and confused by this, the 15th North Carolina abandoned their post and fell back in retreat to a redoubt in the rear. However, the Vermonters were also in serious danger. Much of their ammo had gotten wet in the crossing of the river. The expected signal to Baldy Smith on the far bank for reinforcements didn't come as the assigned signalman had been killed. Further, Baldy Smith had fallen from his horse and was incoherent. Precious time was wasted without exploiting the crossing. Meanwhile, the rebel line roared into action. Brigadier General Howell Cobb, a former governor of Georgia, U.S. Treasury Secretary, and Speaker of the House, sent in his brigade to reinforce the 15th North Carolina and 2nd Louisiana. The 7th Georgia led the attack, supported by the 8th, 11th, and 16th Georgia. The 7th and 8th were commanded by a colonel named George Tige Anderson. Under this pressure, the Vermonters finally cracked and fell back under heavy fire across the Warwick. McLaws reinforced this sector with his entire division. At 5 p.m., Baldy Smith, now recuperated, attempted another attack, sending the 4th and 6th Vermont under fire below the dam, but neither attack was successful. This ended the Battle of Dam No. 1. The Union suffered 165 casualties, and the Confederates suffered 90. Both sides praised the heroism of the Vermonters, and 2 soldiers would eventually be awarded Medals of Honor for their service here. One of the Vermonters killed was a Private William Scott, who had been pardoned by Lincoln from a firing squad after falling asleep at his post in August the previous year. He had vowed after the pardon to show that he wasn't afraid to die for his country. It had been the 3rd Vermont's and 15th North Carolina's first battle. The blame for the Union failure fell on Baldy Smith, who some accused of actually being drunk. Others, however, blamed McClellan for not wanting to bring on a general engagement. The same day, the Confederate Conscription Act was passed, and it would prove extremely unpopular with the enlisted men. The siege dragged on. Monotony and the exchange of fire continued as McClellan labored to finish the heavy gun batteries. A Lieutenant Vines Turner of the 23rd North Carolina later wrote, quote, "The trenches themselves filled with water and could not be drained. Yet the artillery and rifle fire of the enemy held the men close down in them. No fire could be kindled day or night without its becoming the focus of heavy shell fire, and it was therefore strictly forbidden. The only food was flour and salt meat, and these in diminishing quantities. Food was cooked by details in the rear and brought forward to us. Men sickened by the thousands. Soldiers actually died in the mud and water of the trenches before they could be taken to hospital. And many of the cases of illness were measles. This exposure meant death. Thus, unavoidably, died a dog's death many a gallant fellow." Unquote. Rations on both sides were an issue. Only very basic staples reached Johnston's men on the Warwick Line. For the Federals, they had to forage from the countryside for meat. Every day, frontline pickets would skirmish. The Union brought up the 1st U.S. Sharpshooters, commanded by a Colonel Hiram Berdan, and comprised of the best marksmen from around the nation. Companies of Berdan's sharpshooters dispersed up and down the line, killing any rebel in range. A second ironclad, the Galena, arrived around this time to assist the Monitor in keeping the Merrimack in check. Johnston brought Gustavus Smith's and Longstreet's divisions down to the peninsula, bringing the total rebel strength to 56,000 men. He also reorganized the command structure of the defenses. D.H. Hill, a division commander in Johnston's army, took over command of the defenses around Yorktown and Gloucester Point. Longstreet took charge of the center, and Magruder was left in charge of the right flank from Dam No. 1 to Mulberry Island. Gustavus Smith's division was held in reserve near the halfway house. This effectively demoted Magruder, which irritated him. On April 19th, significant skirmishing occurred near the White and Red Redoubts when Union troops were sent forward to disrupt rebel picket posts. The Jamestown, Raleigh, Teaser, Patrick Henry, and Beaufort gunships deployed off Mulberry Island on the 21st and shelled Union positions. On the 22nd, more skirmishing occurred at midnight, when rebel forces probed Federal lines in the night. The 19th Mississippi went forward and were stopped by the 7th Maine. Company M of the 1st Massachusetts then charged across an open field under fire and captured a lunette, scattering rebel defenders. The Massachusetts men broke down much of the lunette's parapets before withdrawing. On the 29th, the siege entered its 4th week. Johnston, aware of the heavy Federal artillery accumulating and the near completion of the Union earthworks to house them, again advised Richmond that he would not be able to hold the peninsula. When asked how long they might be able to hold on, After the bombardment began, D.H. Hill thought that they might be able to stand for 2 days. Johnston instead guessed 2 hours. Hearing this, Lee implored the Merrimac to attack the fleet, but the ship's new commander, Flag Officer Josiah Tatnall, absolutely refused. By this point, the Monitor and Galena had been joined by a third ironclad, the Naugatuck. Tatnall said he would halt any moves up the James River or Norfolk itself, but no more. McClellan prepared his assault to begin on May 6th. Heavy guns would begin the bombardment on the White and Red redoubts as well as Wynn's Mill. The most powerful guns would fire on the Yorktown and Gloucester Point defenses. Once destroyed, Union gunboats would sail around the Narrows and begin firing on Yorktown from the rear and on the Yorktown-Williamsburg Road. On May 1st, Union forces unleashed a heavy bombardment on Yorktown to test their range. Transport vessels on the town's wharves fled up the York River. This action further convinced Johnston of the urgency in leaving. The following day, William B. Franklin's division, previously on board transport ships, disembarked at Wormley Creek to bolster the number of troops for the impending infantry assault. The same day, however, Johnston ordered the withdrawal. Some Confederates had expected it, but Magruder was despondent. One of his staff later wrote, quote, "I shall never forget the morning that General Magruder, lying on his sickbed worn out by the arduous duties of 3 weeks, a strain enough to have killed any ordinary man, summoned me to his room and directed me to prepare for the move. The tears coursed down the old man's cheeks, and rising on one arm with dramatic effect, he pointed to his little army and said, 'Sic transit gloria Peninsula.'" Unquote. The next day, the Confederates opened a major bombardment in the evening to cover their retreat, and slipped away in the night. By the morning of the 4th, all the rebel earthworks and trenches were empty. Troops that entered the abandoned works discovered the first use of landmines in the war. Columbiad shells buried in the ground and rigged to detonate when stepped on, injuring many soldiers who tread on them. McClellan prepared to rapidly pursue Johnston. He ordered Franklin's division back onto their transports so they might quickly disembark at Eltham's Landing and cut off their retreat. Union cavalrymen began fighting with Confederate cavalry around Lee Hall and Skiffles Creek Bridge and around Kings Creek. The rebel cavalry were commanded by a brigadier general named Jeb Stuart. Union forces pushed the rebels to take refuge in some redoubts outside of Williamsburg, and Union infantry began to arrive in the area by nightfall. That marked the end of the siege of Yorktown.